sprouts are starting to come out. So right about there. Now, when he's made his hole, I'll spread the roots out in a fan shape, again, keeping it right at the proper depth in relation to the top of the soil. Okay, you can let it go, Eliot.
Then I pull the spade out, and the soil neatly goes across there, and the strawberries in there at just the right depth. Now we're going to put these in down the center of this bed at about 12 to 18 inches apart, depending on the vigor of the variety. And this is called the row system. A single row down the middle of the bed. You ready for the next one?
Go for it.
What will happen in this bed is that strawberries multiply themselves by runners, and each plant will send runners out to fill in the area along the side. And by next summer, when these are cropping, there will be plants all over this area, and we will really have a bounteous crop. This row system is the best way to do June bearers. But when I plant everbearers, those are plants that I can actually get a crop from the year I put them in the ground. I do them a different way. I do them on what's called the hill system. Fill in. On the hill system, I put one plant every place I would like them to grow. And the reason I do this for everbearers is that everbearers will give me a crop the year I plant them, and they'll give me the best crop from the biggest and oldest plants, the plants that I actually put in first thing in the spring. And so when runners start to form on these, I'll pinch them off because I want these plants to grow and have space. And if I do that, they will give me a massive crop of delicious strawberries the whole second half of the summer on the year I put them in the ground. It's been about 3 weeks since I put these strawberry plants in, and now comes the next step in helping them get established well. I'm going to pinch off the blossoms. Now, that may seem like a strange thing to do, remove any chance they have of making fruit, but I'm doing it for a very good reason. These plants are too small to both grow and make fruit at the same time. And I want to grow good, healthy plants here. Big leaves, good root systems, so I can get an exceptional crop next year on these June bearers. And the best way to do that is to take off the blossoms this year. Now, with the everbearers, they have a much longer blossoming season than June bearers. So if I take off the blossoms for the first 2 months after I put the plants in the ground, I can then let them form after that on the everbearers and get a delicious fall crop of strawberries. What we're doing is very simple. You just take your thumb and forefinger and pinch that blossom off just like that. And not just the blossoms, because it's taking a lot of energy for this plant to make the buds also. Learn to recognize them and pinch them off as soon as you see them. You may think you're wasting this year's crop, and I suspect you are, but you'll really be happy next year when you get an enormous quantity of berries because you did that work this year.
I've got a tasty little fruit crop right here in my flower garden, alpine strawberries. They're very similar to the wild woodland strawberries that we have around here, but a little bigger than that, and they bear over a much longer period of time. Lots of them in early summer, sporadically through the summer, and another crop towards the end of the summer. They're very, very tasty. You're never going to get a great big pie full of them the way you will with our regular strawberries over in the vegetable garden, but they're also a very ornamental plant as well. They've got the typical strawberry flowers, cute red fruits, and also a nice tidy mounded habit. They're not sending out these long runners the way the ones in the vegetable garden are, so they're a great edging plant here for my rose garden. These were planted last year, and now they've become a nice bushy border. Next year they might need some rejuvenation, so in very early spring, just as growth is starting, I'll dig them up and divide each clump, replant part of it, and then make a whole other edging somewhere else in the garden. Then I'll have even more tiny berries to sprinkle on a bowl of cereal or on top of a creamy pie.
Now that's a well-armored, newly planted fruit tree, and this is a new idea for protecting them. I was in Australia a year ago, and I noticed where they were planting new forests, there were little tubes protecting the young seedlings that had been put out. When I returned to the U.S., I looked around and I found out that products like this were available from forestry catalogs, and you could ask the company where you buy your fruit trees. Basically, they're called tree tubes, and what they do is give the tree a protected growing environment when it's young. This model also comes with a little mesh net that you can close over the top when you first put the tree in there to keep a bird from going down in there, which has happened, and you certainly want to prevent that. Now, when the tree does grow out the top, you could take this protective mesh off, or you could do as I've done, open it up and let the protection for the tree, maybe against an animal or something, continue on for a while longer. And you have all your problems solved. Except one. You might have a real deer problem. If I did, I would drive a stake around the four corners here and put some sort of metal or plastic fence around a little individual tree. If I had a lot of trees, I might want to put some sort of very effective fence around the whole orchard. If I were a deer walking up to a small orchard or garden with a perimeter fence of this material, I wouldn't be able to get in because it's 7.5 feet tall and a very effective barrier. But what makes me most pleased as a landowner is because it's black, it's almost invisible, and I don't have to look at it all the time. As far as I know at the moment, this material is only available from Benner's Gardens in New Hope, Pennsylvania. Gardening Naturally will return on TLC. South Zero Winery is a delightful place. Its owner, Tom Hoy, is one of those fortunate individuals who has managed to turn a hobby into a business. Tom makes wines from unique ingredients: apple, chokecherry, blueberries, and rhubarb. Tom's always around somewhere. The way to find him is to ring the bell. Hi, Tom.
Good morning, Eliot.
How's your spring been?
It's been a beautiful spring. Everything's a little late, though.
And how do you judge that here?
Well, the lilacs are usually in bloom for my daughter's birthday, and they're at least a week late this year.
It's a great way to tell. And how's the rhubarb doing?
I think it's ready.
Well, let's cut some then, Tom.
All right. I'll just give it a twist. Take it out, cut off the leaves. Put the leaves here to compost.
Now, as many people know, rhubarb is not technically a fruit. It's a stem. But since it comes early in the spring when there aren't any other fruits and has the right taste, it's used for fruit dishes, like rhubarb pie and, of course, for wine. Now, what's the secret of growing good rhubarb, Tom?
Well, rhubarb, as you know, is a perennial, and it's a simple plant to grow. It's not bothered by many insects. Its basic requirement is that it's a heavy feeder and needs a lot of manure, put on preferably in the fall.
So it's ready to make it grow in the spring?
That's right. It's one of the first things to pop up after the ground freezes.
Great. Well, let's start harvesting some. I'll help pull, you cut.
All right. This is a pressing shed.
Okay, now this is the first step in winemaking.
Yeah, this is where we have to press the fruit. We have to grind the fruit before we press the juice out of it. And that's what this...
Great gadget this is.
Yeah, isn't this
great?
great?
The stalk in there?
Right. And
now, what would somebody do at home if they didn't have one of these?
Well, they could use any kind of a kitchen blender, maybe even a wringer washer.
And the whole idea is just to break the stem up enough so that when you put it in the press, the juice is...
That's right, so we can get as much juice out of it as possible. Now that we've crushed the stalks, the next thing is to press the juice out of them.
Boy, that's a great old press, Tom. Where would someone get something like this?
Isn't this a beauty? Well, if you're lucky, you might find one of these in a yard sale. But actually, any of those backyard apple cider presses would be great for pressing rhubarb. That's a great color.
Isn't that a beautiful color? Oh.
Too bad we have to add water to it.
Yeah.
But
what happens if you use it straight?
No, it would I think it would be overwhelming.
Well, after 2 hours, we've gotten about all the juice out that we can. Now, how do we turn this into wine, Tom?
Well, Eliot, we want to pour it through the funnel here in the strainer into a glass container where we can see what's happening.
Now, how much sugar and yeast needs to be added, Tom?
Well, Eliot, I add 2 pounds of sugar per gallon. And yeast, you can just get one of those little packets which will do 5 gallons.
And where does somebody get a packet of yeast?
Oh, you can get them in any beer and wine supply store. A general all-purpose wine yeast is fine.
And after that, it's just a question of waiting around?
Well, yes, we fill up the carboy and then we put in one of these little fermentation locks.
Now, that's a cute little gadget. What is this doing?
Well, that allows the carbon dioxide to bubble out through the water, but prevents the oxygen from coming back in and spoiling the wine.
And when is this wine ready to drink? That's the important question.
Well, I'd say 6 months to a year. It's just about right.
That seems like a short time.
Well, some wines benefit by longer aging, but I like rhubarb when it's young and fruity.
Yeah, well, it looks good to me. Now, let's pretend a year has passed. Can we go and taste some of last year's production?
I think that's a great idea. Well, here it is, bottled up, Eliot. Last year's rhubarb. I think it's at its peak now, but certainly good for another year in the bottle.
This is very professional looking, Tom. I love the label, I love the picture, but I especially like the wine. I would say fruity with a hint of down east flair.
I wanted to show you a planting of mature raspberries. So I'm visiting my friend Diana Bristol, and she's got some wonderful ones. This happens to be a great variety called Purple Royalty, which is actually a cross between a blackberry and a raspberry, and that's why those berries are so big and fat and juicy. She has a very simple system of trellising here, just some stout rustic poles with some strands of heavy-duty wire attached, and this gives her something to tie them up to so they don't flop down into the pads. The paths are great too. Just a strip of mown grass, and it comes up very close to the base of the plant, and this discourages weeds. Now, these berries that bear only once in the season bear on old canes. So these canes were formed last year and are now producing raspberries. These, on the other hand, are this year's canes, and they're not producing. Now, what Diana's going to do late this winter is cut all of this back to the ground. These, on the other hand, she'll leave for next year. But since this is such a vigorous plant, she says that she thins these to about 3 canes per plant so that it doesn't become such a jungle here. Now, I'll show you what technique she uses over here for her ever-bearing raspberries. Ever-bearing raspberries aren't exactly ever-bearing. They bear twice, once in fall and then the following summer. Now, this is a cane that bore last fall, and now it's the following summer and it's bearing again. This one is this year's new shoot, and it will bear this fall and then again next summer. Now, there's 2 ways of handling raspberries like this. You could cut them all down in the middle of the winter and let the new ones come up and only bear a fall crop, which would be fine if you had a row of summer ones over there somewhere. On the other hand, some people like to get those 2 crops, especially if it's the only row of raspberries they have. In that case, you would cut down these, as Diana does, after they've finished bearing, and have more room for the new ones to come up for your fall crop.
Once the newly planted ever-bearing strawberries are well established, I let the flower buds form so they can begin making fruit, which we will eat all summer and through the fall, but I take off the runners because I don't want the plants using up any energy on them since I don't need the extra plants. I want it all to go into fruit. By taking good care of these ever-bearing strawberries, I've gotten to the point now where we can enjoy them. I pinched off the runners and they put all their energy into growing good strong plants with lots of fruiting branches. And now that it's past the middle of the summer, the fruit are starting to ripen, and they'll continue to ripen and be pickable right on through till hard frost. Whereas strawberries are a fruit that you can either get the year you plant them, or at least the following year, to get your blueberries to this stage is going to take a few years, but it's definitely worth the wait, because high bush blueberries are a very vigorous plant, and they live a long time. In fact, you'll be picking blueberries off your plants for 40 to 50 or even more years. But don't pick them just because they're blue. A lot of people are going to look at these and say, aha, they're all ripe, but they're not quite all ripe. Here's 2 blueberries who both look blue on the surface, but when you turn them over to the stem end, that one is ripe, this one is still red there. And this one is going to be a bit sour. You're not going to enjoy this. This one is going to be like heaven. Now, that's a trick to remember when you're picking blueberries. Wait a little longer, look at the backside, and you'll get the perfect one.
Is it just because we grew these strawberries, or are they really the best you ever tasted?
Oh, there's no question in my mind. When you grow them at home, you can leave them on the plant and ripen them to the very peak of perfection. And even though there's a bit of labor involved in establishing your home fruit crops, once they're growing, you get to enjoy them for years to come.
And while we enjoy the fruits of our labor, goodbye and good gardening.
This is the reward that every tomato grower looks forward to. But to start at the beginning, we really have to go back about 6 months. In order to grow those wonderful tomato crops, you need to start with good plants. And before you have plants, you need to plant some seeds. But before you can plant seeds, you need to make some choices. Now, when I say choices, I mean a lot. In this garden seed inventory from the Seed Savers Exchange, which is a group of amateurs that save old-time varieties of seeds, there are 40 pages devoted to seeds of tomato varieties that people have saved. And in this book, Cornucopia, which is a source book of every seed sold in the US by seed catalogs, there are 233 tomato varieties described. Now, these vary from large to small, from early to late, from red to yellow to striped, every possible combination. So how do you decide which ones you're going to grow? Well, when I'm looking through a seed catalog, the first word I look for is flavor. If it tastes good, that's the tomato I want. And most seed catalogs, they're pretty honest. This will say exceptional flavor, great flavor, good flavor. Now, I never let myself be fooled by a colorful description, something that says big red market tomato. Now, that might sound exciting, but that's probably the one that's designed to be grown by a large commercial grower who's going to ship it, and that isn't going to be the best tasting one to grow in your home garden. So I've gone through all these different choices, and I've made my decision, and every year I guarantee myself I'm going to get down to just 2 or 3 tomato varieties. Well, I'm embarrassed to admit that there's about 15 packets here between last year and this year, and I did get down to 8 varieties for this year, at least until a package arrived from a friend in Italy. Yeah, there's hundreds of different ones other parts of the world too, offering me 2 wonderful new varieties. In fact, one that is supposed to be absolutely delicious even though it still has green shoulders when it's ripe, something one normally wouldn't think of. Well, I've made my decision and I'm ready to plant my seeds, and the way I prefer to plant them is in soil blocks. In a previous show, we demonstrated the specifics of making soil blocks, but let me just reiterate here. I like them because they're space-saving, they're money-saving, I don't have to buy plastic pots, and they grow an exceptional tomato plant. They're space-saving because we start with small ones, just 3/4 inch cubes made by a little cuber blocker. And when I'm ready to plant, I'll sprinkle my tomato seeds on a little plate like this where I can see them, moisten the end of a dowel, and that's just enough friction to pick the seeds up one by one and put them in the center of each of those little blocks. The advantage of this is that each tomato plant then has its own little block to grow in, and when I move it on, as I will, to a larger size growing area, I no longer have to disturb the roots as I would if I were digging it out of some soil. Now, the next step is to move it to a larger growing area. This is a 2-inch block made by this blocker here with a cubic hole in the top of it. And that means that I can just take my little tomato seedling and move it on very quickly. Now, these are all nice little seedlings, but I prefer not to let them get this old before I move them on. I prefer to transplant them when they've just germinated. Then there's less root disturbance, and I find that I get a much better plant later on, the less stress that the little seedling goes through. Once those have grown and matured, we now have nice little plants like this. And there's one more step to go. The secret in growing a really good tomato plant to put in the garden is to grow it in a big pot, so it has lots of room. Well, there's also a big block. That's made with this blocker here. It also has a hole in the top, just the right size for one of these to fit into, and so I can pick this up and move it on at the right stage. This little seedling was just germinated. That's maybe 8 days old. This one here has been around for maybe 3 weeks, and now it'll go on for another 3 weeks till it's 6 weeks old in here, and then it'll look like one of these plants here. Now, I prefer to put a 6-week-old transplant into the garden. Any bigger than that, the tall, spindly ones, or the ones that already have blossoms or even are starting to make fruit, are under much more stress when you put them out and won't do as well over the long run. You take a healthy, vigorous 6-week-old plant and put it out. Now you've got a plant that's going somewhere. Now, if you don't have access to soil block equipment, or you prefer to grow in pots, the same rule still applies. You want your plant to have lots of root room, and therefore you want to put it into a large pot for the last 3 weeks of its growth before it goes in the garden, either a round one like this or a square one like this. Now, there is a way to treat a pot so it will grow a better plant, an awful lot like a soil block does. I take a saw and I cut slits in this pot. And what that does is get air around the root system so the roots, when they're growing, meet that air and therefore cannot circle around the pot. The advantage of that is that the roots then stay at the edge of the soil in here rather than circling, and when you put it in the ground, just like the roots of a soil block, they're ready to shoot out into the soil and get established well. Whether you're growing in pots or in soil blocks, remember, the key is to give the plant plenty of good, fertile root room.
Gardening Naturally will return on TLC.
I'm out here in the garden having a tea party, but in this case, the tea isn't for me, it's for my tomato plants. This is manure tea, or compost tea. I made sure that the manure I used was well composted. I could also have used a pure plant-based compost. And I have mixed 1 part of manure to about 4 parts of water in here. And what I want are the water-soluble fractions of that I can then use to give a pick-me-up to the tomato plants. It's also valuable for any plant in the garden. And to do that, I would just open the jar and pour a cup or so right around the base of the plant, and then move on to the next plant. But this product also has other fascinating qualities. Research in Europe has shown that a manure tea, if it is made right in that same ratio, about 4 to 1, and if it's aged for 7 days, has incredible preventive properties against the diseases that tomato plants get, especially the blights. In order to do that, I have filtered it here through a cheesecloth, just to make sure I had a clean sample, it wasn't going to clog this little sprayer. And the technique that's being used is merely then to spray it on the leaves, as if I were using any other product. And what happens, and this is what's fascinating about the research, is spraying on the liquid tea, compost, manure tea, whatever you want to call it, seems to induce resistance in the plant against the leaf diseases, the same way putting compost in your soil makes the whole plant more vigorous and healthier. Now, remember, about 1 part compost or manure to 4 parts water, and let it set for 7 days. They were very specific on this in the research, that 7-day sitting seemed to be the key to making it as effective as possible. If there's anything all gardeners can agree on, it's the desire to have tomatoes ripen as early as possible. And I'm no different from anyone else. And so I set out my earliest young plants in a cold frame. Now, cold frame is just this set of boards around the side with a glass cover on top that keeps it extra warm in here. And when I put my little plants in there, an interesting thing happens. Because the soil is warm and it's early in the season, they are able to send their roots way out into the soil and establish an enormous root system before they even begin to grow enough to touch the bottom of that glass. Now, if I've set them out early enough so they are pushing the bottom of the glass and it isn't safe to take it off yet, I will just set another strip of wood around here, say 2x4s, same size as this, and then raise the glass up another 4 inches. Let them come a little higher. But that's usually enough, because I've usually only put them in here about a month before the safe outdoor date. And then I can take off the glass. Now, because they establish that incredible root system, they are healthy and ready to grow up and be really vigorous from this early start. I put 2 different varieties in here, though. I put an early, like this early Cascade, but I also put a late delicious variety, like Carmelo, on the back. And the reason I do that is that gets me the delicious late variety about a month earlier than I would get it if I set them out of doors. I'm getting them early and I'm getting them delicious. Who could ask for anything better than that? Now, the other technique that I would use if I didn't have cold frames would be to warm the soil before I put my outdoor tomatoes in. And what I've done for these is to cover the soil with a black plastic like this that warms the soil extra early. This happens to be called IRT plastic, for infrared transmitting plastic. It lets the heat, the warming rays of the sun through, so they warm the soil without letting any light rays through, so weed growth will start. No weeds, warmer soil, warmer roots, better root growth, and an awfully vigorous tomato plant. The whole idea in getting early tomato growth is to give them the optimum conditions when you set out your young little plants. My next technique for getting the earliest tomatoes is to prune the plants to one stem in order to focus as much energy as possible into setting and ripening fruit. Now, if you're going to do this, you want to remember to get an indeterminate variety. Look in the seed catalog and make sure it says indeterminate variety. Those are the ones that will keep on growing and making fruit at the same time. Now, the way you do that is to take out the suckers that appear on the stem between the leaves and the stem they grow. Now, if they're as big as that, they're easy to see, but I like to take them much smaller, almost the size of these up here, so the plant isn't putting any energy into creating it. But when you're up here doing this, there is a sucker and it's going to go, snap. You want to make sure that you understand which is the main stem, which is the leaf branch, and which is the growing tip of the plant. The growing tip of the plant is right behind my hand here. And if I prune that out, I will kill the whole plant. So pay very close attention. Here is the stem, here is the leaf branch, here is the growing tip of the plant, and this is the sucker that's going to get pruned out. And I do it just with a simple snapping action, and it comes out. Now, if there is a large one like this, and I left this one here on purpose, it serves to grow me some new tomato plants to put into my fall greenhouse for fall production. If you live in a climate where you can have both a spring and a fall crop, this is a great technique. You take an early sucker like that, snap it off, and just put it in a glass of water like this, as if you were trying to root any cutting.